"We've got evidence linking you to the break-in at Jerome Harris's house," McAdams said, her voice cold. "Fingerprints, security footage, and a pretty clear motive." Turner shifted in his seat, a flicker of panic flashing in his eyes. "This is insane," he spat. "You really think I'd throw away my career for a couple of watches? I've been on the force for 10 years. McAdams didn't flinch. "You were in debt. Desperate. Maybe you thought no one would ever suspect you because you're a cop. But we've got you, Greg. The evidence is there." This is a true story of Jerome Harris that recently happened in Wisconsin of America. Jerome Harris had always valued his peace and privacy. His modest home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood in Wisconsin, was his sanctuary, a place where he could unwind after long days of work. He enjoyed the simplicity of his life, a routine that brought him comfort. Jerome had built a life for himself through hard work and perseverance, something he was quietly proud of. Living alone meant everything was on his shoulders, but Jerome didn't mind. It was the life he had grown used to. That night, the air was still, with the only sounds being the occasional rustling of leaves outside. Jerome had turned in early, as he usually did, feeling the weight of exhaustion pull him into a deep sleep. He lay comfortably in his bed, unaware of the events about to unfold. Outside, a figure moved silently through the shadows, his steps deliberate and cautious. The man was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a mask that hid his identity. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had studied Jerome's home for weeks, taking note of his habits, the times he left and returned, the way he moved around inside. Tonight was the night he would make his move. The masked man reached the side of the house and effortlessly slipped a crowbar into the window frame. With a quiet grunt, he pried it open just enough to slip inside. As he entered, his movements were swift and precise, as if he had done this before. He navigated the house with confidence, making his way towards the valuables he knew were there. A small safe, Jerome's prized collection of watches, anything that could be easily taken and sold. Jerome stirred in his sleep, a faint creak in the floorboards outside his bedroom pulling him from his dreams. At first, he thought it might have been his imagination, the remnants of a bad dream. But when the sound came again, louder this time, his eyes snapped open. Fear settled in his chest like a heavy stone as he listened. Something was wrong. Jerome slowly slid out of bed, his heart racing. Barefoot, he crept to his bedroom door, listening intently. The sound of drawers being opened and things being moved in his living room confirmed his worst fears. Someone was in his house. For a moment, he considered hiding or calling the police, but he felt trapped by a mixture of fear and anger. This was his home, his sanctuary, and the idea that someone was invading it filled him with a surge of adrenaline. He grabbed a heavy lamp from his nightstand, holding it in front of him as he slowly stepped into the hallway. When Jerome entered the living room, his eyes quickly locked onto the masked figure rifling through his belongings. Without thinking, Jerome shouted, "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The intruder, startled by Jerome's voice, turned to face him. For a brief moment, the two men stared at each other in silence, Jerome, frozen in shock, and the intruder, calculating his next move. Then, in a flash, the masked man lunged forward. Jerome swung the lamp, but it was too late. The intruder struck him with a force that sent him crashing to the floor. Pain exploded in Jerome's side as he felt the cold steel of a boot pressing into his ribs. He tried to fight back, but the masked man was stronger, more prepared. "Stay down," the intruder growled, his voice muffled by the mask. Jerome could barely respond, the pain clouding his thoughts. He lay there, helpless, as the man gathered up the valuables he had come for. The last thing Jerome remembered before he passed out was the sound of the front door closing and the intruder disappearing into the night. The sun was just beginning to rise when Jerome regained consciousness. His body ached from the struggle, but it was the emotional toll that weighed heavier. His home, the place that had always felt safe, was now a crime scene, violated by a stranger who had shattered his sense of security. Disoriented, Jerome forced himself to sit up. His living room was in disarray, drawers pulled out, items scattered across the floor. His safe had been cracked open, and the watches he had spent years collecting were gone. The reality of what had happened crashed over him, and for a moment, he just sat there, breathing heavily, trying to process it all. After gathering himself, Jerome reached for his phone and dialed 911. His voice trembled as he spoke to the operator, explaining the break-in, the assault, and the stolen items. Within minutes, the flashing lights of a police cruiser illuminated the street outside his home. Two officers, both white men, arrived and quickly began assessing the situation. Jerome felt a wave of discomfort as they moved through his home, snapping photos and asking questions in a detached, almost mechanical way. Despite being the victim, he felt more like a spectator, as if the investigation was something happening around him rather than for him. When Detective Rachel McAdams arrived, things felt slightly different. She was calm, professional, and seemed genuinely interested in what Jerome had to say. McAdams had seen her share of home invasions, but something about this one unsettled her. The precision with which the intruder had moved, the way he had known exactly what to take, suggested that this wasn't some random act of burglary. As Jerome recounted the events of the previous night, he noticed that McAdams listened closely, her pen moving swiftly across her notepad. She asked detailed questions, not just about what was taken, but about any strange occurrences Jerome might have noticed in the weeks leading up to the break-in. "I've never seen anything suspicious," Jerome said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I don't understand why someone would target me." McAdams frowned, her mind clearly working through the possibilities. "The way this was carried out, it doesn't feel random," she said after a moment. "We'll look into everything." As the hours passed and the officers completed their work, Jerome began to feel a gnawing sense of unease. Despite McAdams' diligence, there was something off about the way some of the officers were handling the case. They seemed almost indifferent, going through the motions without any real urgency. It was a stark contrast to McAdams, whose intensity was clear. Jerome couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't taking this as seriously as they should. That evening, as Jerome sat alone in his ransacked home, the weight of what had happened finally hit him. The safety he had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. He knew that McAdams would do her best, but deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if justice would truly be served, or if this would just become another unsolved case in a long line of unsolved crimes. Jerome was determined not to let that happen. He vowed to keep pushing for answers, no matter how long it took. A week had passed since the break-in, and Jerome's sense of frustration only grew. Despite his hopes, the investigation felt stagnant. He had called the precinct multiple times for updates, but the responses were always the same, vague reassurances that the case was still being worked on. Jerome began to wonder if his case was being placed on the back burner. But then, a stroke of luck changed everything. One evening, Jerome's neighbor, an older man named Mr. Davis, knocked on his door with a surprising revelation. Mr. Davis mentioned that his security camera, which faced the street, might have captured something important. Jerome's heart raced at the possibility. The next day, Jerome called Detective McAdams and explained the situation. She agreed to meet him and Mr. Davis to review the footage. They huddled in Mr. Davis's dimly lit living room, watching as the grainy footage played on the screen. At first, it seemed uneventful, just the usual stillness of the street late at night. But then, a dark figure appeared, walking swiftly from the shadows, heading toward Jerome's house. The figure's face was obscured, and he was dressed entirely in black, but one detail stood out: his posture. He moved with a calculated, deliberate precision. McAdams leaned in closer, rewinding the footage to watch it again. This was no random thief. The man's movements were too practiced. "What do you think?" Jerome asked, his voice tense with anticipation. McAdams didn't respond right away. Her eyes were still glued to the screen, watching the figure. "This isn't just some opportunist," she said finally. "The way he's moving, it's like he's trained. This isn't his first time." A chill ran down Jerome's spine. He had suspected that the break-in was planned, but hearing McAdams confirm it made it real in a way that left him uneasy. "Trained?" Jerome repeated. "What do you mean?" McAdams paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It's possible we're dealing with someone who knows what they're doing, Someone with experience in this kind of thing? Jerome frowned, trying to make sense of what she was implying. You mean, like a professional burglar? McAdams didn't answer directly. Let me take this footage back to the precinct and see what I can find. I'll be in touch soon. As she left with the footage in hand, Jerome felt a mix of hope and dread. Hope that the investigation was finally moving forward, and dread at the possibility that his home had been targeted by someone far more dangerous than he had imagined. Days passed, and Jerome continued his life with a growing sense of paranoia. Every creak in the house, every shadow outside his window, filled him with unease. He felt like a target, like someone out there was still watching him. Then, a call came from McAdams that changed everything. Jerome, I think we're onto something, she said, her voice measured but intense. Can you come down to the precinct? There's something we need to talk about. Jerome's mind raced as he drove to the police station. What had they found? Was the intruder someone he knew? His anxiety grew with every passing moment until he finally reached McAdams's office. Inside, McAdams closed the door behind him, her expression serious. I reviewed the footage, and I started looking into anyone in the area who might have the kind of training we're seeing in that video. Jerome's heart pounded as she continued. We ran some forensic tests on the scene again, and we found something we missed before, McAdams said, pulling out a file. Fingerprints on a window ledge. They match one of our own. Officer Greg Turner. Jerome felt the air leave his lungs. He had met Turner once or twice in passing. A tall, clean-cut officer who seemed friendly enough. But now? Now, Turner was being named as the prime suspect in the break-in that had left Jerome beaten and terrified. McAdams continued, Turner's been a police officer for nearly a decade. He's well-liked by most, but I've been looking into his finances. He's in deep debt, gambling problems, maxed-out credit cards. It looks like he was desperate for money. Jerome could hardly believe what he was hearing. A cop? A cop broke into my house? McAdams nodded grimly. It looks that way. And if he's behind this, he used his position to plan the whole thing. He knew how to avoid suspicion, and he probably thought no one would ever connect the dots. Jerome's mind reeled. The very people who were supposed to protect him, who had promised to find the man responsible for this crime, had one of their own behind the mask. It felt like a betrayal of the worst kind. What happens now? Jerome asked, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. We're going to bring him in for questioning, McAdams replied. But we need to handle this carefully. We can't tip him off just yet. I need you to sit tight for a little longer. A few days later, the police precinct buzzed with quiet tension. Turner had been brought in under the guise of a routine meeting, completely unaware that he was now the prime suspect in a home invasion case. McAdams and a few senior officers led the interrogation, with Jerome anxiously waiting for updates. Inside the interrogation room, Turner maintained his calm facade, but as the questioning grew more intense, cracks began to show. We've got evidence linking you to the break-in at Jerome Harris's house, McAdams said, her voice cold. Fingerprints, security footage, and a pretty clear motive. Turner shifted in his seat, a flicker of panic flashing in his eyes. This is insane, he spat. You really think I'd throw away my career for a couple of watches? I've been on the force for 10 years. McAdams didn't flinch. You were in debt. Desperate. Maybe you thought no one would ever suspect you because you're a cop. But we've got you, Greg. The evidence is there. For a moment, Turner said nothing, his jaw clenched tight. But then, under the weight of the mounting evidence, he broke. Fine, he muttered, leaning back in his chair. Yeah, I did it. I needed the money. I didn't think anyone would get hurt. McAdams stared at him, disgusted. You didn't think about Jerome, about the fact that you left him unconscious in his own home? Turner didn't answer, his silence speaking volumes. After hours of interrogation, Turner was officially arrested and charged with burglary, assault, and abuse of power. News of his arrest spread quickly, and the community was left reeling. A police officer, sworn to uphold the law, had used his training and authority to commit a crime. Jerome, for his part, felt a mix of relief and anger. Justice had been served, but the betrayal still cut deep. He had trusted the system to protect him, but in the end, it had been someone from within that system who had violated his safety. The arrest of Officer Greg Turner sent shockwaves through the Wisconsin community. It wasn't just the betrayal of trust that stung. Turner was a symbol of authority, someone people turned to in times of need. Now, he stood exposed as a man who had abused his power for personal gain. Jerome sat at home, still reeling from the news. The bruises on his body had healed, but the emotional scars ran deep. He had never imagined that someone like Turner, a man whose job was to protect people, could turn into such a predator. The community was buzzing with gossip, and everywhere Jerome went, people expressed their outrage. He heard it at the local diner, at the grocery store, and even from neighbors who had once trusted the police without question. Detective McAdams remained a steady presence throughout the process. She kept Jerome updated on the investigation, making sure he knew that Turner would face consequences. It gave Jerome some comfort to know that Turner would be held accountable, but the betrayal still gnawed at him. As the legal proceedings began, Turner's actions became the subject of heated debates in the media. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the public was demanding more transparency and accountability from the police department. Protests erupted in parts of the state, with people calling for reforms to ensure that such abuses of power could never happen again. Turner, once a respected officer, now faced serious charges: burglary, assault, and misconduct while in uniform. The evidence was overwhelming. His fingerprints at the scene, the video footage, and eventually his own confession. Despite attempts by his lawyer to paint him as a man under financial strain who made a desperate mistake, the facts were clear. Turner had planned and executed the break-in with full knowledge of what he was doing. As Turner's trial loomed, Jerome struggled to find peace. The emotional toll of the experience left him feeling isolated. While many in the community expressed their support, there were others who whispered doubts. Some questioned why Turner had targeted him specifically. Jerome overheard conversations suggesting that there was more to the story, feeding into stereotypes and underlying racial tension in the town. But the truth was simple. Jerome had been a victim of a crime, just like anyone else could have been. The fact that Turner was a police officer made the situation more complicated, but it didn't change the core of what had happened: an abuse of power by someone in a position of trust. Jerome had to testify in court, reliving the night of the break-in as lawyers questioned him about the attack and the items stolen from his home. Standing in the courtroom, facing Turner, was one of the hardest things Jerome had ever done. Turner, shackled and looking down at the floor, refused to meet Jerome's eyes. He was a far cry from the confident man who had invaded Jerome's house that night. Detective McAdams sat in the audience during the trial, her presence a small comfort to Jerome. She had been one of the few officers who had taken the case seriously from the start, and Jerome appreciated her dedication. It made him believe that while some people in the system were corrupt, there were others who truly cared about justice. The trial dragged on for several weeks, but in the end, the verdict was clear. Greg Turner was found guilty on all charges: burglary, assault, and abuse of power. The judge, in a scathing statement, emphasized how Turner's actions had violated the public's trust and endangered the very people he had sworn to protect. His sentence was harsh, a reflection of the severity of his crimes and the betrayal they represented. For Jerome, the guilty verdict brought a sense of closure, but it didn't erase the trauma of the experience. He still woke up at night, startled by small noises, his mind flashing back to the moment he had confronted the masked intruder in his living room. His home no longer felt like the safe haven it once was, and the realization that someone with authority had targeted him left a permanent scar. The story of Turner's arrest and conviction spread far beyond Wisconsin. It became part of a larger conversation about police accountability and the dangers of unchecked power. Turner's fall from grace highlighted the cracks in a system that many people had long taken for granted. People in the community began to demand reforms, and protests in support of victims like Jerome gained momentum. Through it all, Jerome remained quiet, focused on healing. He knew that Turner's prosecution was a rare instance of justice being served, and he hoped that it would bring about real change. But as a black man living in a country where trust in law enforcement was often a complicated matter, he couldn't help but wonder how many other people had faced similar betrayals without the closure he had found. In the end, Jerome found a measure of peace in knowing that Turner would never hurt anyone again. The system had worked, at least this time. And while the scars of the past would never fully fade, Jerome knew that he had survived and that his story, like so many others, had made a difference. The aftermath of Turner's arrest left a lasting impact on the Wisconsin community. Conversations about reforming the police department took center stage in local government meetings. People, once hesitant to question authority, now demanded more transparency and better oversight of law enforcement. Jerome, while still healing, became a quiet symbol of resilience in the face of betrayal. Detective McAdams, who had handled the case with integrity, gained recognition for her work. She was promoted and became a vocal advocate for internal reforms within the police force, pushing for stricter protocols to prevent officers from abusing their power. As for Jerome, he slowly began rebuilding his life. With support from friends and neighbors, he started to feel a sense of security again, though it was forever changed. His experience had exposed the deep flaws in a system that many relied on, and though justice had been served, the scars of that night would always remind him of how fragile safety could be. But Jerome's story wasn't just about one night of violence. It was about resilience, about standing up for what was right, and about holding those in power accountable when they crossed the line. His fight for justice was a victory, not just for himself, but for the community and for others who had been wronged in the shadows. And in the end, it was a reminder that justice, while not always swift or certain, was worth pursuing, even when it meant taking on the very people sworn to protect.